Welcome back to another session of CMAS, fellas. And today we're going to be talking about drinking and drug use as it relates to manliness or maybe the lack thereof. Today we see that everybody that is doing something fun on TV always happens to have a glass or a bottle in their hand. It seems as if when you're watching TV or you're watching commercials or you're even watching movies that all the people that are having a great time are always sipping on bubbly, getting drunk, drinking. And I remember when I was a kid, I used to listen to rap music, right? And back in the 90s, all the rap stars, all the rappers were drug dealers, right? But today it seems as if all the rappers are drug addicts. I think that all started with Lil Wayne. So when I was listening to Biggie, he was trying to sell drugs, and the kids that are listening to it today are trying to get high on drugs. So it almost seems as if everybody's drunk, everybody's high, all the celebrities are doing it. Even those who are in search of spirituality are getting high on different drinks and drugs to discover God. And so it seems like it's sort of ubiquitous across the culture. You're either getting drunk for fun, you're getting drunk for spiritual elevation, you're getting high, you're doing all these kinds of substances in order to maybe achieve greater states or experiences in life. But yet, the church forbids all these things. Why? Is the church just trying to make us miserable, trying to keep us away from discovering our true selves through DMT, the God particle? Or is there a reason why drunkenness and drug abuse or drug use is forbidden? So we got my guests here today, CMAS crew, Tim Gordon, Mike Robillard. Today, Will seems to be caught up in something. He might be a little bit late. We'll bring him on when he comes in. But I'd like to open up maybe with just a personal question from both of you. I'd start with you, Tim. Have you ever been a drug user, somebody who gets high on anything? Were you ever a binge drinker in college or anything? Have you ever experienced this sort of lifestyle?
No, I've never done drugs ever. I've never smoked a cigarette, but in college I was drunk far too many times. Well, like many young people, but I always firmly rejected the drugs. And as a youth, even when I was playing in a band until 18, 19, I was straight edge. Which is the East Coast hardcore and punk philosophy that goes along with the hardcore and punk scene, rejecting drinking and smoking and fornication. They used to call straight edge a gang. I remember Geraldo called Carl Buechner a gang member on national TV one time. That was a lot of fun. So straight edge in high school and half of college. So the only times I ever really suffered from giving into drinking was in later college and, a few times in my adult life. But a lot of people miss that drugs, unlike alcohol, which can be mortally sinful on its own, are, as you already mentioned, Elliot, a gateway to the spiritual and the demonic. Even not just LSD, but pot and things like that. So I hope we talk about that a little bit today.
Yeah. In your drinking days, have you ever gotten like blackout drunk? You ever passed out, woke up in a pool of vomit?
I've woken up in pools of vomit a few times. Blackout drunk. I don't know if I ever was so drunk that I didn't remember anything from the previous evening. I think I've been pretty close a few times. Very, very, very drunk, which is mortally sinful, of course. But no, I don't think I ever blacked out. Have you?
No, I don't think I've ever blacked out, but I've gotten pretty damn pissy at certain times in my life. Mike, what about you, man?
Yeah.
I know you were in the dating scene for a while, hanging out with the dudes. were you guys getting drunk? Were you guys getting high? Have you ever used anything so that you can see God?
So much like Tim, yeah, I came up in the straight edge scene as well. And I was actually straight edge until I was 24 and a half. And, through West Point and the military, there are elements of it. It's a big drinking culture, and that's looked at as just normalized. And so I was kind of looked at as sort of like an oddball that, you know, couldn't lighten up, I guess, until I eventually had a friend beg me to start drinking, because there's I was gonna like pop, and so I did. I get and you know it. I would say, yeah, it sent me on a road of a lot of self-medicating with alcohol when I was in the military and afterwards. This is before even getting into any of the pickup world. But yeah, so I think that's always been an issue is, yeah, self-medicating with alcohol. And I think that's been bad. A lot of my worst decisions, I think, that I've made, especially when I was in that pickup lifestyle or just in general, in grad school as well, began with drinking and drinking too much and then making bad decisions that kind of went, sideways. Um, and then as far as, I mean, I guess I experimented with marijuana, but thankfully it didn't do much. I have an addictive personality, so I very much could have got addicted to it, but thankfully, like, it didn't do anything. So that never was an issue. And then once I was actually misprescribed some psychiatric drugs from the army, and I went through what I guess is described as amphetamine psychosis, and that was pretty nuts.
Shit.
So until I realized, oh, wait a second, this is I'm going crazy and I haven't slept. So I walked away from that. Thankfully, no one got hurt, and that that I think it's been my set of experiences. I know a lot of veterans are very much into like psychedelics, and I guess there is some positive stuff coming out now about like MDMA for like PTSD, recovery and whatnot. I don't know about that. I worry that could also become, as Tim said, that could be like a slippery slope to the demonic or to I don't know, subverting people's reason. But I don't know. I guess that's sort of mixed bag of associations there with that question.
Will has joined us. Thank you, Mike. Just want to acknowledge that Will has finally gotten here. How you doing, brother?
Yeah, good. Sorry I'm late. Loads of family stuff going on. But I'm happy that within about 5 seconds of joining, I heard demonic mentioned. It's good sea mask stuff.
Yeah, that's the second time it's been mentioned, both related to drug use and drunkenness. And so we opened up, both Tim and Michael were very gracious to share their experience with, binge drinking in college or, being on the scene. What has been your experience as a man growing up with drinking, drug use? We got guys who are puffing on stuff and drinking things to meet God and using it for all kind of different reasons. What's your experience?
It's everywhere, isn't it? And it's presented as being what men should do to be manly. And it's another one of those areas in modern culture where the opposite is true. Because if you develop a vice, especially with drink, then it's a form of effeminacy because your attachment to the pleasure of the drink or the reduction in inhibition that comes along with it, that can stop you from acting rationally. And that's what being effeminate is all about. It's about being taken off the right path by the attraction of pleasure or by the hardship that the pain of the right path involves. I think it's a form of softness, and all right, you might not end up alcoholic straight away, but you can do eventually if you're not careful and you don't moderate your drink intake. So that's the key thing for drink. It can be okay if you do it moderately, but some people can't do that, and they need to just be teetotal. When it comes to psychedelics, I don't think they are ever okay. It takes quite a lot of drink to be able to actually make you lose rational control, but you can do that in one hit of a psychedelic dose that's enough to get the mystical experience that people say they're using it for. So I think that's just a no. And I didn't catch the full comment relating it to being a doorway to the demonic, but if you listen to guys who've taken 10, 15, 20 trips, specifically trying to use that to get some kind of spiritual experience, a lot of them will relate experiences like that. I don't think we can take a step towards God. He has to come to us, and then using drugs like that to try and do it, that just ends up with you opening a doorway to hell instead. You don't end up just walking up to heaven by your own power.
So much good stuff there, Will. You dove head first right into it. I want to back up for a second, though, and ask, what has been your experience? Was there ever a time when you were, drinking heavily with your buddies, or ever got caught up in any of the drinking or drug use?
Yeah, especially as a teenager, when you're not given clear guidance about what's right, what's wrong from some of the people in your life who should be doing that, and you just go along with your peers. And at that age anyway, you're generally foolish and experimenting. So I've almost died from drinking too much as a teenager, not knowing what the appropriate amount was. And that was a close call. I had friends as well who've ended up sectioned from psychedelics, and just seeing the danger that can come from that. Some people might seem like they get away with it initially, but keep doing it for enough years and you see that they don't. So I've definitely had experience of it personally and also with people in my life. So I tend to be cautious about it. I don't like people who have a really blasé attitude like napping, because it really can.
Yeah. Let's bring it up to today. I'll ask each of you. Tim, what is your practice as it relates to drinking today? Do you have a couple glasses of wine on the weekend or with your dinner and bread, or do you abstain completely, or is it an occasional thing? How are you guys using alcohol or anything else right now?
Typically, my wife and I go out on a date once a week, usually on Thursday nights. I think we went out last night, and that's typically where I'll have a couple drinks. We have a nice place we go to. It's right near the house, and yeah, I enjoy the food of dry martini or a beer or a amaretto sour or something like that. I'm not. You did all the shit now. You're supposed to be into whiskey. I never was a whiskey drinker. I never liked whiskey. Even though that's supposedly one of the elements of masculinity, if you listen to people who don't really know. So I yeah, but I don't have at all an addictive personality. I can do something I'm addicted to not getting addicted to things. I can do something 5 weeks in a row and then not do it again for 2 years. So, and that I often end up doing. And in some ways you suffer from that sort of personality, not with dependency on chemicals or anything. And, yeah.
Michael, are you?
I use it as a food.
Using anything or drinking, or, how is it, in your life now?
For a while, for all last year, I guess, once I got back into training, and in preparation for the fight, I wasn't drinking at all. And I wasn't desiring it, it just wasn't a habit. After that, I suppose I got a bit more relaxed with that. But I'm still, a long time since I've been drunk, I suppose. I think it's been years since I've been drunk. And like days like this, I suppose St. Patrick's Day. I think I'm mainly Irish, and I think that's always been like this alcoholism's ran in my family. That's always been like the Irish curse, and so I think I recognize that there is that propensity to like with alcohol in particularly to for that to be a particularly prone vice. So days like this, I think I've always sort of been extra like staying away from like social occasions where people tend to go nuts. But in general, yeah, I guess maybe a beer or two a week if it's around. If not, then I'll go several months. It's whether it's in the fridge or not, I suppose.
I just want to pick up something that you dropped off here and stick with you for a moment. So I did forget to mention today is St. Patrick's Day. I wear green every day, so it blends right in. But it seems as if, you being an Irish guy, and St. Patrick evangelized the Celtics, right? The Irish, and converted an entire nation. When and how did that get associated with getting hammered?
I don't know. I mean, I guess the history I always told is that guy that wrote the book, whatever, how the Irish saved Europe or something like that, where the ale was actually the fermenting process made it more medicinally pure than the water that was bad. So that had some effect with respect to drinking, and that just ended up being part of the culture. So I guess that's one just so story as to how it became so part of the Irish culture. Is that it started out being a necessity because the water was so bad.
Will, are you a moderate drinker? Do you abstain completely? Are you using anything these days?
Yeah, I'm fine with having a bit of alcohol, especially at social occasions when you're out in restaurants, and I can drink a fair amount without getting drunk, so I don't make a fuss about rules. So it's like, 2 drinks and I'm done. I think if people know what their own personal tolerance is, that's the main thing, and you don't go over that, that's when it becomes a problem. I'm not into fine wines and whiskey and all the rest of it and reading books about it and sitting around talking to people about it. I think that's when it becomes a bit effeminate and you're taking too much pleasure in the food, which is just a form of gluttony. So I don't really go into all the culture surrounding it, but I'm quite happy to have a drink or two. And I think alcohol's actually got some health benefits. I think it's protective for the heart, and moderate drinkers live longer than teetotalers. So that's something for people to bear in mind. It has actually got some health benefits to it. But I don't think that's a reason for anyone to take up drinking if they currently don't and know that they've got like Mike said, a propensity towards alcoholism. You're better off having none. But yeah, a bit of wine or beer, especially with meals. But I never, when I'm by myself at home, if I'm feeling stressed or down or anything, I don't just go and buy myself some alcohol and sit by myself and drink it. I would never take that approach to it.
Why do you think it's so seductive to so many men? Why is it a problem? It seems like you guys are moderate. You'll have something or not every once in a while, but there's this draw to gluttony and indulgence and getting hammered quite often, particularly with men. It seems that, more men are drug addicts, more men are alcoholics, as opposed to women. We've used the word effeminate, but what is it in men that draws us towards these vices and keeps us trapped?
I think that men have a harder life than women in so many ways. And the narrative about patriarchy as oppression and male privilege gets that wrong. If you look at the number of suicides, far more men than women. You look at mental health related problems with work, men, it's far more common. General stress as well, far more common in men. So guys are looking for some kind of solution to this, The truth, of course, is that men, because they're at the intersection of the private, the domestic sphere of the home, and then the public sphere as well, they have all kinds of extra pressures and challenges that a woman who's been taken out of the workplace by a loving husband doesn't have to deal with. And he's putting himself between her and that onslaught. And he needs greater grace in his life because of that. But so many men aren't actually calling on God to help them bear that load. Instead, they turn to the bottle. I don't know what you guys think, but instinct for why these problems are more common in men. The only other one is that men in general are bigger risk takers and have more edge to them, more of an extreme personality.
Yeah,
Tim,
I
what would you
was gonna say that philosophy.
Yeah, I was just
it
going to pass
begins
the
in
mic to you,
wonderment.
brother. Go for it.
Sorry. Yeah. I was literally just that point that meant not that there's virtue behind experimentation with alcohol and certainly not drugs, but men generally are, as a kind of base intellectual curiosity, they're much more experimental and even men are philosophers if they're wise, if they're talented by their nature. Women aren't. And so I knew a lot of men that were not wise but intelligent, that were really interested in experimenting with drugs. I had a friend in Plano, Texas, die of a heroin overdose in high school. That was called an epidemic at that time. Plano, Texas, the black tar heroin capital of the world. One of my friends had been one of the people to die. So I just never saw the virtue in that kind of experimentation, but a lot of men do. It's not typically something women don't have the what Lonergan called the pure desire to know. In this case, the pure desire to feel different things. Some men, you meet them and they're from the outset just really interested in, I want to feel what that feels like. Luckily, that's not any of us, but it's definitely a disordered version of a masculine thing.
You know, I'm studying theology of the body. A friend of mine passed a book on to me, and I've been really fascinated with it and discovering that, our crave for union with woman is actually a crave for our union with God and being whole with him. It seems as if, just kind of following along that same line of what you're putting down there, Tim, with the men wanting to have a certain experience, to feel certain things, it seems today as well, a lot of psychedelics, ayahuasca trips and DMT, and Joe Rogan. Will sent me a pretty funny meme about Rogan bros who are using these drugs to meet God, but they'll fall asleep and they'll see a giant spider with the head of a frog telling them that whatever. So it's always these like kind of weird experiences. Why is it that men are seeking God in psychedelics?
Because of the nature of the deceiver, Satan. Probably the primary way that folks are getting possessed, or at least obsessed, in our day is through marijuana. It's not just psychedelics. People all think, LSD, that's one of the paths to possession. Marijuana, as a distinction of kind, it is probably the most common. A lot of men, like 98% of them, are addicted to pornography, and that's the habituated grave sin, is maybe the more common route. But if we're talking about direct, like, doors to the demonic and satanic possession, marijuana use, which has become almost ubiquitous, is probably number one. And you guys, I don't have to tell you, I've been aiding at this exorcism out of state. I shifted a sea mask about 8 weeks ago for one of the first sessions of it. I've been continuing to do that, and the more I learn about it, the more one-time marijuana usage can be a door to this that even mortally sinful drunkenness cannot.
Really? if you don't mind, I'd like to stick with you on that because there was a time where I was using marijuana daily. I got caught up in it for about 4 years, maybe a little bit longer. And now I hear you saying that as opposed to drinking, which will get you drunk, marijuana use may be one of these things that can open the door to something satanic, something spiritual.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is standard knowledge, common knowledge among exorcists that somehow it got out there that only psychedelic drug use is a portal for, an invitation for demons, but marijuana as well. And remember, marijuana can have these psychedelic properties. So I'm not an expert on the matter, but it's much more commonly used, and it doesn't mean it will happen. I mean, it sounds like you, with all the sum total of other graces happening in your life, escaped it. But when you go through an exorcism, it's the two big questions are, what's your name? That usually tends to come at the end, the name of the demon, and when did you enter? How did you get in? That also tends to come at the end once you're working toward the resolution. And it seems that that's one of the big contenders for how the demon gets into people that haven't willingly, knowingly gone to things like black masses. So it's one more reason to just stay away entirely from all drugs.
What spawned me to bring this topic to the table today was listening to the Liber Christo War College podcast with Jesse Romero. And he's written a book about marijuana, and in it they refer to an article, a secular news article that spoke about the rise in psychosis and schizophrenia in an entire generation of young people who are now using legal marijuana, and how it's much different than the Cheech and Chong weed back in the day, where I think it was referred to having only about 4% THC, where now a lot of these guys they're smoking these waxes that are highly condensed, that are upwards to 40% THC, which is totally blowing people's minds and sending them into psych wards. Mike, kind of to circle back with the same question, went down a little bit rabbit hole there. Why do you think it is that men are so drawn to these substances as a means of escape or even a means of reunion? Why are we seduced and trapped in many instances?
Yes, I think it's several things. I mean, one, it's getting back to Will's point about modern man being in this very unnatural, modernized industrial world where they're put under a lot more stresses than women generally are, and they're very disconnected from their bodies and from nature, and I think that adds up. I think ironically they're more stressed, but they're ironically also more bored. So in the absence of having activities in the past where you would have been out in nature, hunting, fishing, working with animals, working with your body, these things would have been natural, therapeutic, natural, de-stressing, natural, stimulating things. And we've removed that, and now we're cubicle dwelling bugmen for the most part, and that's going to add up. Right, that's going to add up both in terms of anxiety and boredom. So if that can't be offset by getting reacquainted with our bodies, with nature, with physical labor, then I think that men are going to reach for some type of surrogate in the form of something like alcohol or drugs to tamp down the anxiety or to stimulate themselves feeling bored. The other thing with respect to this popularity of psychedelics or ayahuasca or DMT. I want to do a whole episode on this, but it gets back to this idea that Tim's talked about before about the Miyagi complex, and it's this just unsaid idea that wisdom is to be found anywhere other than through Christendom, right? It has to be found in the forests of the ayahuasca, in the jungles of South
Right.
America, or from the cactus in the mescaline cactus in Mexico, or some other psychedelic drug or substance coming from the Far East. Right? It couldn't possibly be through reason. It couldn't possibly be through prayer and fasting. It has to be some esoteric thing coming from outside of Christendom. And I think that is informing, so it ends up being this window dressing for the demonic or the vicious, but it gets repackaged as being somehow enlightened.
Yeah. The Miyagi complex is so profound. And I had definitely fallen victim to it in my life, where I would look for absolutely anything except for what was in my backyard, what was in my own home, what was known to grow the West. And also these various other, traditions are taboo, which is also seductive, right? If somebody tells you not to do something and you see someone else doing it, it's just that tendency to want to know, right? I guess Tim mentioned that earlier. So it's interesting that these are substances that are oftentimes found in nature, but they're packaged, they're produced, and they're marketed to us. And we're seeing it, of course, we saw with alcohol. And I think a lot of people are actually becoming privy to alcohol now. It's just been over promoted and people are starting to wake up. Same thing happened with cigarettes, right? Tobacco, but it's like weed now is the new one, right? And it's like all the doctors are telling you why it's good for PTSD and why it's good for anxiety, and so it's medical, and and then it's packaged in these nice, colorful, fruity flavors that you can get, and basically even in the states where they're illegal, they have legal forms of it. So they're going around the wall to get it in front of people. In one of the non-canonical books of the Christian faith, you could say the book of Enoch, there's a section on how the fallen angels delivered various quote unquote technologies to man in order to, maybe give him power and instruct him in means that are powerful but not productive, but maybe not resourceful totally for us. And among those was what they referred to as pharmacopoeia, I think is the word, but it's kind of where we get the word pharmacy from. Also can be translated as sorcery. And so we have pharmacists. Pharmacists at one point was considered the most prestigious career in America. So we have, the whole world telling us and prescribing for us and shoving down our throats and seducing us into the use of these forms of sorcery, in essence. What does the church teach us? I'd like to start with you, Tim. I know you're kind of like a lawyer in terms of what the church teaches. What does the church teach about pharmacopoeia, sorcery, drug use, and why?
Well, remember, human being is an animal, but that's our genus. Our specific difference, what makes us the species of man, is that we are the rational animal. So intentional diminutions of our rationality, like getting drunk, are mortally sinful. And I always labor, for starters, Elliot, just to say, look, if you get the pothead in the room fired up about distinctions of degree between levels of inebriatedness between alcohol and pot, then you're going down the wrong path. I've never smoked weed, but Some people say it's very similar. Some people say it's a very dissimilar experience to being drunk and being stoned. Mm-hmm. That's the wrong path. The path that the church takes is to say, those who have spoken on it, say, look, there's a distinction of kind here. Even though it's mortally sinful to be drunk, I'll address that as the primary means of answering your question, Elliot. But there's a totally different kind of thing happening, much as, folks who do drugs will say, oh, it's a totally different kind of high between smoking weed and doing the more overtly psychedelic drugs with those properties. So just don't even think of them as the same as a species under the same genus. But Aquinas, in question 150 of the Summa, I'm assuming it's the second part of the Summa, question 150. The first article is whether or not drunkenness is a sin. Secondly, and of course he says it is. Secondly, he begins down the path, is it a mortal sin? And he goes through some really satisfying objections to why it's not a mortal sin. The church has always followed him on this. You could probably follow from the first objections to the proposition that drunkenness is a mortal sin. The first one is that it is probably not a mortal sin, which he'll rebut later, because assiduously denotes a circumstance which does not change the species of a sin, so that it cannot aggravate a sin infinitely and make a mortal sin of a venial sin. Therefore, if drunkenness is not a mortal sin for some other reason, it can't be a venial sin simply for the reason of the veniality of having one too many drinks, not a mortal sin. How this can never become a mortal sin, and he beats that down. He says, no, a venial sin can become a mortal sin by degree. He objects to it in the second way by saying, quoting as St. Augustine, whenever a man takes more meat and drink than is necessary, he should know that this is one of the lesser sins. He's talking about gluttony there, Augustine. Aquinas says in his fake objection, now the lesser sins are called venial, therefore drunkenness, which is caused by a moderate drink, is a venial sin. He's going to beat this objection down by saying, taking too much food does not remove your specific difference as a rational animal. It does not diminish your reason. And by the way, Aquinas and the church have always mercifully taught that the amount that your reason has to be gone for drunkenness to be a mortal sin is like, it's a high bar, luckily, to pass. It's not just if you're a little buzzed. It's you have to be beside yourself, is the term he uses. The third objection he goes down that's interesting is fake, and he'll defeat it later. No mortal sin should be committed on the score of medicine. Now, some drink, this is the pharmacopoeia stuff you're talking about, Elliot. Some drink too much at the advice of the physician that they may be purged by vomiting. From this excessive drunkenness ensues, therefore drunkenness is not a mortal sin. But in the corpus of this question, 150, he says, on the contrary, we read in the canons of the apostles, quote, a bishop, priest, or deacon who is given to drunkenness or gambling, or incites others thereto, must either cease to be deposed. A subdeacon, reader, presenter who does these things must either give them up or be excommunicated. The same applies to the laity. Now such punishments are not inflicted save for mortal sins, therefore drunkenness is a mortal sin. I answer that the sin of drunkenness, as stated in the foregoing article, consists in the immoderate use and concupiscence of wine. So he's not equating moderate use and concupiscence, which is like a celebration of our fallen state. That's what concupiscence is. So it's immoderate use, and the church has always taught this from Augustine to Aquinas. And I think it's a relatively clear distinction to make, even though people have tried to blur the line.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Will, I have a question in terms of the difference between abstinence and moderation, right? So we have different Christian denominations that are completely opposed to drinking, like don't have a sip. I don't know how they define it, but they don't drink at all. And then, of course, Muslims are against drinking. They don't drink. They don't drink at all. What are your thoughts on why it would be allowed in moderation versus just making it being abstinent completely from anything, from drinking?
Well, first up, I think that although it's permissible for Christians to consume alcohol, some people shouldn't. And that's because they might find it too difficult to drink in moderation. They're the type that they might have one drink and it leads to another, and before they know it, they do get that loss of reason and it's mortal sin, and they should just leave it alone totally. But in general, what are we talking about when we say abstinence? This is just a virtue that is a specific one under the general virtue of temperance. So we're just trying to regulate our appetite for food and drink. That's all this means. So wine in itself, or beer or whiskey in itself, isn't good or bad. It's about how you actually consume it. If it was a non-alcoholic drink, let's say you just really like Coke or Pepsi or something, and you eat way too much of it, you drink way too much of it, and it rots your teeth or it makes you fat, whatever it might be. Well, that's just gluttony, because the taste of it is, for you, too much of a draw. You're inordinate in how you consume it. You're not actually in rational control of yourself. So that's gluttony. But when you bring in the fact that the drink is actually intoxicating, like wine, beer, whiskey, any type of alcohol, then this isn't just abstinence anymore. You're actually looking at sobriety in particular. So this isn't the same thing as just someone who really likes chocolate, making sure that they practicing abstinence and not eating too much of it. Sobriety is regarding intoxication especially, and some people know their limits and can stick to them. Great, that's fine. If you are weaker than that and you can't be moderate in your alcohol consumption, best to have none. And the point about psychedelics is that this isn't something that you can consume without it being contrary to natural law, because the nature of the thing is such that it undermines, it's contrary to the function of your mind, which is rationality. So you can have a little bit of alcohol and you're not going to undermine your reason. But if you're using psychedelics to get some kind of mystical trip, there's no safe amount to use. So that's why everyone has to just always avoid them totally. And you'll hear people say things like, but the mushrooms are natural, bro, or the ayahuasca is natural. You can find it in the forest. You just go for a walk and there it is, like fruit. Right. It's natural. But we're not using natural in that sense. It's to do with the fact that it's contrary to natural law, which is what Tim was explaining. What is a human being by nature? The rational animal. So saying that you can find it in the woods, therefore it's natural, is really dumb, because you can find all kinds of poisons in the wood as well and eat them and die. And that's bad. So it's best just to not have any, because it's contrary to natural law. But with some alcohol, fine. If you're the kind of guy who can have a bit, no problem.
In our conversation about why men seem to be drawn into and trapped by these vices, Will, you mentioned that men might need more grace as a result of the pressures of life. What would you say to a man who today may be struggling with alcohol or any kind of drugs, or is gripped in vice? By what means may he free himself? Did you catch that?
I think that, yeah, the last couple of words dropped off, but it was, what would I say to someone who's struggling, gripped in vice? First thing would be, stop trying to fill the God-shaped hole in your life with things that are bad for you and can't fix your problems. The other thing is that whatever you might have done in the past that you now realize from having listened to the CMAC show or whatever other things in your life have made you realize you're going down a bad path, you might not have had full knowledge that what you were doing was wrong. So let's say you were going to convert and you've spent your first, two decades of your adult life tripping all the time, getting drunk and fornicating or whatever. When you come to make your first confession, then what you're in a situation with is that you've done a lot of stuff that when you did it, you didn't know that it was a mortal sin. So you can talk to the priest about this, but the most important thing is you go there and confess, rather than thinking that some state where it's impossible that you could ever be saved or you could ever turn your life around. I think that's one of the big tricks that the devil uses to get guys to despair. So there's always hope, no matter what mess you've got yourself into, as long as you are willing to take the step and ask for Christ's help.
That's amazing. So go right to the sacrament of reconciliation. Go and confess your sins and be absolved. Get into grace. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Right. And
continue, please.
I was just going to say that it's really important that you've probably done a lot of things that you were told were okay by other people in your life or in just the media or whatever, through the school system, that you now realize actually weren't okay. And especially if you were just a kid at the time, it's important to have some compassion for yourself, and God will too, because you didn't have full knowledge, there wasn't full consent, etc. Otherwise, people can end up suicidal in that kind of state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that's even born out of a sense of pride in many instances, even though it's a disordered pride that you may not label as such, but the idea that we could save ourselves and that somehow by my will, I can overcome this and that I should be strong enough to do it. Absence of the void or absent of the grace of God, it is nearly impossible. It will be very impossible for a lot of people. And oftentimes those addictions are a result of pride. So the most humbling thing you can do, both for the support of your soul and the salvation of your union with God, is to humble yourself and go to confession. I agree with that completely. I'd like to pass the ball to Mike, though. So, Mike, what would you say to a man who may be listening to this right now? He's in the grips of alcoholism or some other vice, and he's tried and tried. He wants to free himself from it. What advice would you give him or encouragement would you give him about how to become free?
I would say, I guess just, what they say with the first step of AA is, first you have to get to the recognition you have a problem. And I think that comes from listening to your conscience. And I think a lot of times when people, if they're hearing their conscience telling them that what they're doing is vicious or against God's law and that they're hurting themselves, sometimes the instinct is to double down and to try to tamp down that small voice that's telling them to repent and to fix themselves. So I think there's always that danger of doubling down, trying to numb oneself out even further. But like what Will said, there's always the possibility for atonement. And I think if one just accepts that God will always forgive one's sins when they're repenting in earnest, then they can turn around. But it just requires that humbling, and it requires listening to one's conscience and admitting that one trapped in vice. I think that's just what it comes down to is not doubling down, but actually listening and taking one's conscience and that small voice in one's heart seriously.
Yeah, I totally understand and agree with everything you said there. Which opens up another question sort of along the same lines of, your assertion and Will's. And is it necessary for a man to, I know this is going to sound crazy given the context of our conversation, but is it necessary for a man to believe in God or to be a Christian in order to most resourcefully become free from this vice?
I think ultimately that's what it is. That's the longing that can't be satisfied with any of these hedonic, vicious surrogates. That longing for God is the thing that they're trying to replace with vice or distraction or hedonism. So ultimately, yeah, it is a God-shaped and a Christ-shaped hole that we're longing for, that folks are being called back to.
That's right. The God-shaped hole. That's what Will said. Tim, I'm going to make it a little bit more personal with you. Like, if you had a close family member, someone you love, maybe even someone in your own home who fell into this vice and was trapped, how would you go about trying to help that person?
Oh, that's a good question. I have folks upward on the family tree. I think both sides. I'm Italian on my mom. Both of those races of people are prone in their own way to the excess. Especially the Celts, the Scots, just like the Irish. So I would say it's a simpler process. If you take it from me, this ain't medical advice, but I think it's a simpler process than what a lot of people believe. I'd say you take it to confession first. If I'm talking to someone in my family who's going to be Catholic, take it to confession. The graces come from God. I mean, even the atheist, the graces come from God. That doesn't mean he has to be a Christian first. He can defeat addiction through natural processes, but those graces, although he does not recognize it, come from God or someone in one of the false faiths. Same story. So if it's a believing Catholic, you just say, well, look, you know where the graces come from for all good things to happen, the source, the font of all goodness. Take it to confession, like Will said, and go as cold turkey as you can. And it's a process where you're filling some hole. Your heart was restless until it's resting in God, even though maybe you're already a Roman Catholic. That means that there's some need, the compulsion that's not being adequated. And some people are just have more addicted personalities. Okay, that's fine. Maybe you're a relatively high functioning Catholic. Go deeper. And go deeper into making better confessions, which is something that is not talked about enough. If you talk to your buddy, even if the pair of you are good Catholics, and you say, "Did you go to confession?" Yeah, I went to confession, so I can receive. But there's a whole spectrum of quality of confessions, and priest friends tell me this sometimes. Oh, that was a really good confession. Not every time I go, but there's a thoroughness and a real medicinal quality to making the best confession of your life that no amount of therapy or 12-step programs can fulfill. Anytime we're talking about the nature of sin, even if it's addictive sin, the medicine can be the graces of God. The medicine is the graces of God. And even if you go through some effective secular 12-step program, it's the graces of God working there. So I'd just say go directly to the source like Will. I mean, I'm not an expert on addiction or anything, but it's interesting because Aquinas notes 5 ways of gluttony. We should talk about that sometime, not just one. The 5 ways of gluttony is something I'd like to do a show on with you guys at some point that I think gives great insight into this question. I'll save it for later, but it's all about God's grace. That's the end of the picture. I'll say that much now. And confession's the most direct route.
Amazing. So, both you and Will mentioned the demonic, and you, in fact, also mentioned being a part of an exorcism, supporting those someone who may be trapped in a vice or something else. And all 3 of your answers were very spiritual in nature. How do we know that the vice is spiritual, demonic, as opposed to physiological, chemical? Are there some indications that prayer and referring to God's graces is a means rather than maybe medical means by which someone can overcome this?
Well, it's an important question. I mean, not like I said, what I've learned over the last couple of months aiding in the exorcism is this is one of the last things you find out. What's the etiology of the possession? What caused it? How did the demon get in? It's always some sort of invitation, but those invitations can be indirect, boring, banal, like just habituated grave sin. But the invitations can be more direct, like participating in the occult or, witchcraft, going to a palmist reader or whatever. But so you don't know until you know, and it gets kooky to treat anyone. Oh, this person likes the drink. This person loves to overdrink on St. Patrick's Day. They must be possessed. That's silly. Right. So you specifically know by being told, but from what I've learned, that happens sort of only at the end when the problem is basically about to get solved anyway, in terms of deliverance ministry, exorcism. So I don't rightly know. I mean, that's the point. If you know exactly how to beat a problem, then it's not really a problem. Some folks are chemically dependent because of their genes. I mean, your genome, your genotype is deeply wound up in this stuff, and that is kind of the most banal version of a natural cause. Some people are for a combination of habits that they formed, ways of coping with stress, like which we've talked about all show long. Are you the type of person that goes home and, like Will said, like drinks alone to take the edge off? I literally have almost never done that, maybe never done that. If you habituate drinking alone, that seems like a dangerous path to me. Again, I ain't an expert, but that might be more than just the genotype that, you become addicted really easily. Or then there's the paths that are more preternatural to demonologically premised addiction. So I don't exactly know, but I know that at the end of something that is preternaturally caused, you find out in most cases, this is how the demon got in. It has to tell you through the binding force of Christ via the exorcist. It has to say. And no, not all instances of alcoholism are an instance of someone being demonically possessed, of course. I think a lot of them are just nature and nurture, bad habituation.
Yeah. That's really important, that although it's true that you can open a doorway to the demonic with some of the stuff that we've talked about today, it's extremely rare. And one of the things that priests are taught when they're learning about exorcism is that you don't just go around assuming that everyone you come across with some kind of difficulty is possessed. In fact, they're told don't easily believe somebody is possessed. And Elliot, if you're asking about what the signs of possession are, I think there's not many of them. It's things like, are they suddenly speaking an unknown language? So have they acquired the ability to speak overnight, whatever it might be, in multiple foreign languages not native to them? Uh, do they know distant or hidden events that they shouldn't have knowledge of? Are they suddenly extremely strong as well? And whenever the name of Christ is mentioned, or anything to do with the church or the word of God, do they have a really strong reaction to that as well? So for most guys who are smoking weed or have got problems with alcoholism, you're not going to find those. This is just ordinary human frailty that is a reflection of the fact that man is more naturally inclined to evil than to good in his fallen state. This is about original sin, the weakness of the will and the intellect. So people are going to fall into all these traps. And I like the movement that I can see all around us on social media of trying to get men to return to virtue and basic natural law understanding of what a good man's life is. But here's the kicker to that. We can't keep even the natural law without God's help, let alone the supernatural law as well, or the theological virtues. So even just this natural law understanding of what a good man's supposed to be, protector, provider, etc., you still need God's help for that. And if you want to go beyond that and live a really good Christian life as well, then you need even more grace.
Well, I'm happy that you mentioned that you're seeing it all around us, that men are returning to virtue. I don't know if it's because we live in a bubble, but I'm seeing the same thing. I don't want to say it's trending, but it's definitely picking up steam. Would you be willing to maybe dive into a little bit of what is possible for a man when he drops vice in his life and ascends towards virtue? And the reason why I say that is because I think a lot of men don't even know themselves outside of a vice. Say, for example, someone who's been binge drinking or smoking for decades in many cases. They don't know themselves. They don't know what's possible if they drop it. But what do you say to a man about his potential, his true potential, and what's possible if he does become free?
Well, knowing what you're supposed to do with your life as a man because someone has explained what natural law involves for you, being the strong head of a family or community, whatever it might be. This is like having a car, and what fuel are you going to put in it? And some guys are trying to run a car on like vegetable oil or something, just something they've botched up in their own garage at home, and it's just barely moving along. When you start putting grace in it, when you start using the sacraments as well, then this is like getting the highest quality fuel you can get. All the engine gets tuned up as well, and then God adds extra things to it. So you'll just notice a massive increase in performance, and then the thing is going to drive better. Your life will just keep you on the road properly. The engine will give you more power, and using that analogy, you're going to get to destinations that you never thought possible. You won't be having all these breakdowns and needing to try and get there just your own steam, which is not going to work out for you, although it might feel like you can do it for short bursts.
That is completely in alignment with my experience. Like I mentioned before, there was a time when I was smoking for quite a bit, and everything that you said there relates. It's like I started putting high octane fuel back into my engine and was able to achieve things that I wasn't sure was even possible until I got my head out of the clouds. Mike, what kind of words of encouragement would you give a man who has found himself trapped, but he doesn't know what's on the other side? What's possible for him?
I guess I would just reiterate really the same message I had before, is that your conscience is telling you something, and that in this day and age where we're being bombarded with this Cartesian, mechanistic, material determinist account of man that keeps telling you that you're just a meat machine, over and over and over again, and that you don't have free will, you don't have agency, you don't have a soul or a mind or any dignity. At some point, it's just there's going to be something inside you that knows that that's false. And I would just say the more you listen to that, and the more you actually attune to the philosophy and theology and Catholic teachings that reconfirm that you are, in fact, made in the image of God, and you do have a soul and a will and agency and dignity, that should be your appropriate reference point to push back against this propaganda that we're just animals, or that we're not even animals, that we're just machines. And I think that framework, that true framework, that the truth of that is the thing that can help somebody who's in a disparate or compromised spot, with prayer and God's grace to begin climbing out of it. But I think first it comes down to appropriately seeing oneself as a being with agency and dignity, and rejecting this Cartesian, Newtonian, mechanistic view of the human person and of oneself.
I like it. What do you say to a man who says all that sounds good? Okay, I'm made in the image of God. I'm a child of God, but that all seems so abstract. When right now I'm just suffering, or I'm craving, and I need to get high. What is it practically? In other words, what I'm asking you to share is, what does a virtuous man look like in the day-to-day? The man who's overcome vice.
I would say that looks like the attuning of one's agency towards what their conscience is telling them to do. And when they do that, they're going to recognize that there's more to them than they think. That even if they're pinned underneath bad habit and vice, that there's more to them than just that. And if they listen to that, and they keep listening to that, then they'll find that there's more of them still. And just keep following that.
Yeah, endless. What I hear you saying is that limitlessness, that endless possibilities are the way that you can open up to what you can't even imagine what's possible for you. Tim, would you be willing to paint a picture for us that would encourage, like a carrot on a stick, a man who's struggling, but wants to find that motivation to become that virtuous man? What might that open up for him? Did you catch that?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Elliot, you mentioned earlier that a lot of times incontinent men that know the path to happiness lies in sobriety simply say, I can't do it. And they say, I can't do it because notions of right reason and right living are like an abstraction. Mm-hmm. I would say that the path back, the answer to what you just asked me, is to say it's not at all abstract. It couldn't be any more concrete. Yeah. The stark difference between living right and the multiple ways of living wrong. So the carrot on the stick is, just imagine, even if you don't know specifically how it'll look, that the times that you were happiest as a child, even if you had an unhappy childhood, the kind of innocent, wholesome surety that you had in one of your happiest childhood memories, those were sober, and they were an inchoate version of what an adult, pure, safe, sober happiness would look like. But there's something for you to at least visualize how great it can be. an adult version of being your best self, where it's really intentional. So, like, everyone clings to something like that. You can't tell me that it's abstract, because everyone has a favorite childhood memory, which is all-inclusive, right? It's all-inclusive. Usually it involves fun and safety. And those are the two antidotes. I'm basing this on what Michael said about the men at work, and Will reflected something similar. It's like, you're really bored and you're really nervous at the same time. It's a killer combo that men go through. Like Niles Crane says when he's learning to waltz, he says, this is boring yet difficult. Like, it could be really boring to go through the monotonous routine of getting up for work, working in a damn cubicle, and yet it gives you anxiety at night. It's a killer combo. So, like, your favorite childhood memory, if you think about it, characterize it, it's always got an element of fun and an element of safety. Well, that's what you could be at your best, on your best, when you're sober. Playing with your kids is really fun and really safe and wholesome. Having a good night out with your wife, or a good night in with your wife, just cooking together, or some simple sublime happiness, it's really fun, is really wholesome and safe. The extreme sports nonsense that's not what's the only thing that's fun. It's fun to do something that's safe and wholesome. Stay in a board game on a rainy day. Everyone knows that board game day really hit the spot last holidays. This is the kind of ethos that we're going toward when we talk about returning to sobriety, something really wholesome and safe, yet fun. Everyone has a memory like that they cleave to. That can be not only in your past, but in your future. But you have to get over the idea that it's overly abstract, because it's absolutely not.
This is so good. Guys, we're here with the CMAS crew. We're talking about whether drinking and drug use is effeminate. We've covered so much, but we've come to a peak in that my three guests assert that if you can overcome vice, you can destroy vice, you can begin dominating life by having a new fuel in your tank, a high octane fuel like Will described. Imagine living life from high octane rather than vegetable oil in your tank. Imagine being limitless, as Michael says, instead of having limitations on yourself and limitations on what's possible and limitations on your ability as a man, that by destroying vice, you can become limitless. And I think greatest of all, or most foundational, is the childlike joy that you might find in your life if you go back to that natural, innocent, safe, but fun place that you might remember as a child, if you ever had that experience, as Tim described. So I'm going to encourage everyone who's listening, especially those of you who are struggling with vice, that you can dominate your life if you get a grip on it today. And we've gotten more than enough information, ideas, inspiration, and support, as well as a vision for what the virtuous man looks like from my guests. And so I want to thank you guys for listening. I want to thank my guests for joining, Tim, Will, Mike. If you guys have any parting words, spit them out. Otherwise, I love you guys, and we'll see you next time.
Love you too, bro. Thanks for having us.
You got it.
Happy St. Patty's.
Cool. Thank you.
That's
Bless.
right. Very cool.
Take care.
Happy St. Patrick's Day, guys. All right. God bless. We'll see you guys next week.
Peace. Bye.